The night began with thunder that wasn't weather. It was the sound of stone splitting, hammer against marble, boot against altar, rage echoing through vaults that had slept for centuries. In the crypt of Saint-Denis, outside Paris, the air was damp and ancient. The bones of kings had lain there in peace since before anyone could remember, until that night in 1793, when peace died before they did. The revolution had already devoured the living. Now it turned its appetite on the dead. The tombs were seen not as relics, but as insults, monuments to arrogance carved while peasants starved. Crowds gathered with torches that hissed in the wet air, chanting slogans that once promised liberty but now tasted of smoke. When they pried open the first sarcophagus, the smell was not rot, but history. Linen, stone dust, embalming herbs long dried. They expected horror. They found fragility. Henry IV's beard, still faintly auburn, clung to his skull. Someone laughed, nervous, then plucked a tooth for a souvenir. The sound broke whatever sanctity remained. From tomb to tomb they went. Clovis, Francis I, Louis Nampime, the saint himself. Their effigies stared in marble silence as the mob dragged their real bodies into the light. Coffins toppled, jewels scattered. A woman dipped her scarf into the preserved fluid of a queen, calling it holy. Another man raised a crown stripped from bone and shouted, "Now we are kings!" Outside, rain began to fall, smearing torchlight into gold ribbons on the cobblestones. The crowd did not notice. They had mistaken desecration for justice, and justice for freedom. Some witnesses wrote later that the storm grew worse as they worked, that thunder rolled each time a coffin cracked. Superstition, perhaps, but even the unbelievers felt it, that the revolution, in all its fury, had crossed a final threshold. The living could be reasoned with, punished, forgiven. The dead, once disturbed, never truly sleep again. When dawn came, the basilica floor was slick with mud and history. Bones lay scattered like relics of a forgotten religion. A child found a femur and used it as a drumstick. Priests who had hidden nearby dared not cry. The mob would have called their tears royalist. And so, before the sun was fully up, France became a kingdom without graves, its past unearthed, its future still blind. By morning, Paris smelled not of incense, but of wet dust and candle wax, the perfume of violated sanctuaries. The revolution had turned the capital into a single mausoleum, half in ruin, half reborn. Churches were stripped of their saints, bells melted into cannon, marble altars ground to powder for mortar. Even the air seemed to mourn, thick with ash from burned vestments. The city had become a coffin, and its people the pallbearers. They marched through the streets in waves, chanting names they no longer revered. To them, kings were not ancestors, but parasites whose bones still claimed sacred space. Every tomb that cracked open felt like justice, hammering at history's door. Yet beneath the fury ran something quieter, a tremor of disbelief. Few among the mob had ever seen a king, and now they met them face to face, shrunken, yellow, strangely human. In the crypts, torches guttered against damp stone, their smoke twisting like the ghosts of confessions. The marble effigies that once prayed above the graves seemed almost alive in the shifting light. Some rioters spat on them, others crossed themselves without realizing it. Old reflexes die slower than monarchs. Outside, wagons waited to carry the royal remains to mass graves dug near the abbey gardens. Soldiers cursed as they lifted coffins heavy with centuries. One burst apart, spilling bones across the courtyard. A child laughed. An old man murmured that the line between rebellion and blasphemy had been crossed. No one heard him over the storm of voices shouting, "Equality!" The National Convention had decreed this purification, calling it necessary hygiene for the new republic. Even the word hygiene felt cruelly ironic, cleanliness through desecration. Ministers spoke of making space for the people's dead, as if memory itself were a disease to be cured. Parisians lined the streets to watch the procession. 12 wagons piled with broken coffins, banners fluttering above them, proclaiming liberty or death. Women threw flowers that landed among ribs and crowns. Men lifted their hats as the carts passed, unsure whether to cheer or weep. The line wound slowly toward a pit outside the walls, the same soil that had once buried plague victims now receiving kings. Night fell again before the work was done. The Basilica of Saint-Denis stood hollow, its stained glass dark, its saints headless. Only the echoes remained, a hollow sound like breath caught inside a coffin too large for any single corpse. In that silence, Paris learned a terrible symmetry. To destroy tyranny, it had to resemble it. The graves were not new. They were ancient scars reopened by new hands. Long before the revolution, the soil beyond Saint-Denis had swallowed plague victims, soldiers, paupers, anyone too inconvenient for ceremony. Now, those same trenches waited again, widened by decree to receive the architects of the old world. Orders came from the Committee of Public Safety. Every royal tomb was to be emptied, every coffin destroyed. Laborers were promised extra bread and wine for their work. Few refused. Hunger was a sharper master than conscience. They dug by torchlight, their shovels striking the marble shards of toppled effigies, sparks flying where sanctity met steel. The night hummed with metal and thunder. The bodies came down from the basilica one by one. Some were wrapped still in silk, others in tattered linens half turned to dust. Labels were attached to each skull, Louis this, Henry that, so historians could someday tell who was who. The idea felt absurd, as if identity could survive dismemberment. When a foreman dropped a jawbone, it broke cleanly, centuries collapsing in his palm. He crossed himself quickly, then remembered the gesture was treason. They lined the pit with quicklime to hasten purity. The chemical hissed as it touched damp wood and skin, the sound like frying rain. Gravediggers joked that it was the voice of kings learning humility. The scent of rot mixed with that of metal polish, for soldiers nearby cleaned their bayonets while guarding the site. Republics, it seemed, required supervision, even for the dead. Each cartload tipped its cargo into the trench. Skulls rolled like dice, crowns of bone clicking together before disappearing under the next avalanche. Some workers murmured apologies. Others sang revolutionary songs off-key to drown the noise. A few wept quietly, pretending it was sweat. By midday, the pit was a tapestry of history. 30 monarchs and queens intertwined, their jeweled relics stripped, their names now equal in anonymity. The lime burned through velvet, through coffin wood, through faces that had once commanded armies. The heat of chemical reaction shimmered above the ground like breath. Spectators gathered on the ridge to watch. They expected horror, but what they saw was strangely beautiful. The white lime glowing against black soil, steam rising like incense. For a fleeting moment, even the most hardened among them felt awe, the realization that they were witnessing the end of divine right, reduced to chemistry. When the last coffin was emptied, the overseer ordered the trench sealed. Earth fell in heavy waves, muffling the hiss below. A red flag was planted over the mound, its pole carved from a church pew. The crowd cheered, believing history itself buried. But the soil remembered. Beneath the flag, the lime cooled slowly, preserving fragments of hair, scraps of parchment prayers, and the faint outline of crowns. Centuries later, when workmen dug foundations there, they would find traces of fabric gilded by corrosion, the revolution's unfinished confession. Even in death, royalty refused to vanish quietly. Months after the desecration, whispers spread through Paris that the abbey's vault still breathed. At night, watchmen claimed to hear muffled knocks beneath the flagstones, the echo of rings tapping from coffins that no longer existed. Rational men laughed, yet none volunteered to guard Saint-Denis after sunset. The revolution had buried the kings, but not their shadow. Inside the city, artists sketched the broken effigies that had once adorned the basilica. The marble faces of Clovis and Francis I, chipped and eyeless, now filled pamphlets as cautionary emblems. Printers sold them cheaply. See how kings crumble. Children used the images as toys, drawing mustaches on saints. In marketplaces, fragments of royal tombs were hawked beside vegetables, a saint's finger traded for onions. The people had found a way to own their history, one relic at a time. Yet the line between ownership and desecration blurred quickly. The same mobs who had stormed the vaults began to turn on one another. Envy replaced unity. Suspicion replaced faith. Some wondered aloud if disturbing the dead had cursed the revolution itself. Bread grew scarce, executions frequent. The guillotine clattered where church bells once rang. Paris began to resemble a new crypt, its squares and alleys echoing with names shouted one day, condemned the next. Among the National Convention's members, a few voices dared to question what had been done. The historian Henri Grégoire, a priest turned patriot, argued that to destroy the tombs was to erase the proof of monarchy's mortality. "Let them stand," he wrote, "so the living may see how even kings turn to dust." His plea arrived too late. The bones were already in the lime. Still, something of the old order lingered, stubborn as perfume on silk. When the Directory rose from the revolution's ashes, fashion crept back into salons, and whispers of lost grandeur stirred curiosity. Merchants sold snuff boxes carved from tomb marble. Soldiers carried lockets containing slivers of royal coffins for luck. What had been rebellion turned into nostalgia, and nostalgia, as ever, bred ghosts. By 1817, long after the terror had devoured itself, a new king, Louis the Saint-Denis, ordered the remains gathered and reinterred. Men with soft hands and guilty hearts dug once more into the pit at Saint-Denis. They found hair still golden beneath the lime, bones still tagged with fading labels. Coffins were rebuilt, crosses replaced, hymns sung again in low contrition. But no one could swear which skull belonged to which monarch. The centuries had finally achieved equality. When the ceremony ended, a single candle was left burning at the crypt's entrance. Visitors said the flame bent sideways, as if bowing toward the ground. Perhaps it was only the wind from an open door. Or perhaps the kings, now nameless together, had accepted at last the only crown that endures, oblivion. After the wagons of bones rolled away and the cheering crowds dispersed, Paris grew strangely quiet. The air that once trembled with slogans and songs now felt heavy, waiting. The city had buried its monarchs, but it could not bury its fatigue. What followed was not celebration but an echo, a vast and uncomfortable stillness that spread like smoke through every quarter. Saint-Denis stood empty, its shattered tombs dark as unhealed wounds. Birds nested where candles once burned. The basilica smelled of damp lime and rust. Rain leaked through the broken rose window and pooled on the flagstones, washing over marble fragments engraved with half-erased names. A few monks returned under disguise, sweeping rubble into corners, whispering psalms to no congregation. They dared not ring the bells. The sound of holiness could still be mistaken for treason. In Paris itself, silence had become a kind of law. The bells of Notre Dame were muted, their clappers removed to be melted for cannon. Without them, the hours lost their shape. People rose and slept by the color of the sky, as if time itself had fled the capital. The revolution had promised renewal, but what it delivered was insomnia. Those who had danced at the desecrations now avoided the basilica's road. Market women crossed themselves before realizing what they'd done. Children told ghost stories about kings wandering the fields at night, their crowns glowing like embers. One rumor claimed a gravedigger went mad after finding his shovel returned to him every morning, standing upright in the soil as though someone below had pushed it back. No one investigated. In the city squares, the guillotine took over where bells once called to prayer. Each fall of its blade was a dull chime, answering the silence of the churches. The crowd's cheers grew hoarse. Even vengeance fatigues the voice. At dusk, the wind carried a hollow music through the streets, the sound of ropes creaking from gallows and flags snapping above abandoned mansions. Paris had learned that without its kings, it was still haunted by the rhythm of their absence. By the winter of 1794, frost rimed the empty tombs. The basilica's doors swelled and froze shut. Travelers passing at night swore they heard faint organ notes drifting from within, though the pipes had been torn out years before. Perhaps it was only the wind, or the city, exhaling the last breath of its own revolution. When spring returned, grass grew over the pits at Saint-Denis, bright and soft, almost joyful. Parisians called it the green forgiveness. But forgiveness, like grass, grows where blood once sank deep. Beneath those blades, 30 kings slept together in a silence louder than any bell. Time, like earth, is patient. For decades, the Abbey of Saint-Denis remained sealed in neglect, a mausoleum for a monarchy no one dared to love or destroy again. Ivy crawled across the walls, pigeons ruled the towers, and the crypt filled with dust fine as flour. History slept, but not forever. In 1817, when France's tides turned once more and a Bourbon returned to the throne, the new king sent men north of Paris to search for the remains of his ancestors. The orders were delicate: restore dignity without reminding the people what dignity had cost them. So the soldiers and priests arrived quietly at dawn. They carried lanterns, linen sacks, and the uncomfortable knowledge that they were about to exhume the dead twice wronged, once by monarchy, once by revolution. The workers dug into the pit where quicklime had once hissed. The soil gave easily, still pale with residue. Within hours, bones began to appear, fragments of ribs, skulls still tagged with scraps of parchment, strands of hair preserved by lime. No one could tell which belonged to whom. The priests recited names anyway: Louis, Henry, Francis, Charles, casting them like nets across the anonymous dead. It was less identification than absolution. When they lifted the remains from the pit, the smell of history returned. Not rot, but iron, lime, and a sweetness like burnt myrrh. Some soldiers gagged, others stared with uneasy reverence. They worked in silence, placing the bones into new coffins lined with white silk. The silk felt wrong, too pure, too new for bodies that had already been taught humility. Later that year, the royal procession entered Paris carrying 30 lead coffins, each marked simply with a crown and a cross. Crowds gathered again along the streets, quieter this time. Some bowed their heads, others turned away. A few whispered that France was digging its own mistakes back up. Yet when the cortege reached Saint-Denis, even cynics felt the weight of centuries. Inside the basilica, the tombs were rebuilt, marble effigies cleaned, altars redressed, candles lit for the first time in 20 years. But something had changed in the air. The saints and kings no longer seemed eternal. They looked fragile, tentative, like actors returning to a stage that no longer believed in them. The monarchy's resurrection was physical, but not spiritual. You can reassemble bones. You cannot reassemble faith. When the ceremony ended, workmen sealed the vault again. The last hammer blow echoed through the nave, and dust fell from the rafters like grey snow. Those who stood listening felt both relief and remorse, as if the earth itself sighed. The kings were home, but home had moved on. Outside, evening settled over Paris. The bells of Saint-Denis rang once more, hesitant, testing their own sound. The tone was deep, cracked, and human, like history remembering its own grief. Centuries later, visitors to Saint-Denis walk softly without knowing why. The light filtering through the stained glass feels heavy, like time slowed into color. Beneath their feet lie more than 70 monarchs, names that once shaped the fate of Europe, resting together under the same roof that had betrayed them. The marble effigies above seem serene, hands folded, faces polished by generations of awe. Yet below, the bones are indistinguishable. Dust is democracy's final form. The revolution meant to erase the sacred, but in doing so, it made the sacred visible. When the tombs were torn open, the people glimpsed something the court had never shown them. Kings who bled, queens who decayed, saints who smelled of lime. That revelation outlived the guillotine. Even now, standing in the basilica's hush, one can feel that strange equality, the realization that every crown ends as powder, every scepter as splintered wood. Historians argue over whether the mob's violence was justice or blasphemy. But perhaps it was both. In their fury, the Parisians turned death into a mirror and saw themselves reflected. They learned that the divine right of kings was only anatomy, and that every throne is merely a raised coffin. When Restoration came, the royal bones were placed in new coffins, their labels rewritten, their sins washed in incense. Yet Restoration could not erase what the soil had taught. The people no longer bowed. They came instead as spectators, curious, unafraid, almost tender. Some placed flowers, others simply stood in silence, unsure whether they were mourning or forgiving. Outside the basilica, life moved on. Revolutions, empires, wars, republics. Each generation added its own dust to the air, its own ghosts to the ground. Paris rebuilt itself 1,000 times, but Saint-Denis remained the city's conscience, its reminder that power, however divine, is still mortal. When the wind sweeps through the crypt's corridors today, it carries a faint, metallic breath. Guides call it temperature change, but those who linger feel something older. It's the sigh of the past refusing to stay buried, the murmur of kings learning humility, of mobs learning pity. Both rest in the same silence now. Perhaps that is the final lesson of those broken tombs, that history, as greatest peace, comes not from victory, but from surrender. The revolution tore the crowns from skulls, yet in doing so, it gave those skulls back their humanity. No one can kneel before dust. One can only remember it. If this story has followed you into the dark tonight, let it stay. Because beneath every monument, beneath every stone polished by reverence or rage, lies the same quiet truth. The living borrow the earth, and the dead keep the receipt. And in Saint-Denis, where kings once dreamed of eternity, the only kingdom that endures is silence.